Justin, we're kind of pulled off from the group. Time for you and I to talk a little bit about your unique journey over the past 3 years and a little bit of background. We were just talking just a minute ago about some of the unique elements into your architecture background. What are some of those and why did you do it?
Sure. So University of Cincinnati, went and got a Bachelor's of Architecture, which was a really good school. And it's funny is, I was going to be a music performance major. And so I, shifted gears in high school to go into architecture and didn't even know it was a good school, right? I just applied because it was in my hometown and applied and got in. And it was a 6-year is long. And so what was neat is we got to do co-op. So that meant we'd go to a quarter for school, go to a quarter full-time work, go to a quarter for school, back and forth. We got 2 years of that. So I really got immersed in right away of learning in work, right? Learning on the job. And I think that set me up over my life of this whole school work, or academia and practice. And so I went out to practice. I went back for a master's degree at the University of Michigan. I could do that in 1 year because I had the 6 year, right? And why I did that is because as I was in practice for the first time post-college, I was sitting there and I was like, is this it? I'm just going to draw buildings, right? Like it just didn't feel fulfilling. And I had found these articles about Rural Studio. So this was Sam Mockbee down in Auburn University, who would take students down into the poorest, areas of our country. They would use salvaged materials and build these beautiful structures for people who had no money, right? Like they had houses and churches and student centers. And so at that point I was like, wait, so we could use architecture and design for the good of humanity? Like, wow, this is mind blowing. So that's why I went back to grad school, was this pivot, because I'm like, I want to do that. And I found practitioners like Michael Piatak, who was doing affordable housing, but making it not only beautiful for the residents, but beautiful, it didn't stick out. Like a lot of signature architects make this really extreme, beautiful architecture, but then the people that live there, they don't want to stick out, right? They want to blend into the context like their neighbors. So different projects like that. And so I found about community design. So this was about designers that worked with communities, typically through community design centers like at universities or nonprofits, and really focused on bringing that community together to help them make decisions on those projects and things that would impact them, right? It wasn't someone coming in and say, here's your building, I've fixed your problem. It was, what do you need? How can we help? And so that, after college, that really was the basis of my practice, my scholarship, everything going forward, teaching after that.
So what do you call all of that when you mix it together?
Sure, And
you're at a dinner party and you say, I
tend to say a community designer.
Okay.
And what I love about that is that crosses everything. It's not just about a community in a neighborhood,
right?
But as we've started to talk about and work with communities of work, right? We've brought that in with Fifth Third Bank. Valerie, you're going to talk about as our client. We started really with them of thinking that concept through of what's it like to be a part of a community of work? Wow. What's that mean? And how can that impact culture, the community of work, the experience of work for people?
And I want to get back to that specific project, but you came on board with BHDP right when the pandemic was hitting us.
Yeah.
What was that onboarding like? What was work like? And how have you reintegrated into kind of post?
So it was an interesting time because I was coming out of academia. So I had the PhD where I'd continued working on that and teaching, doing research on this community work, right? Community design. I was actually doing that in Indianapolis. And so coming out, I decided it's time to go back into practice, right? So we're back to that academia practice back and forth, so many times overlapping. And so as I was coming into BHDP, back into practice, what's funny for me was different, though, is I had worked at BHDP 25 years earlier as a co-op when I was at Cincinnati.
Okay.
Right? And so I had met Patrick Donnelly back then, and 25 years later, he said, hey, come back and do the work that you're doing, but for us, thinking through as a firm, how does communities of work, how does community, how does placemaking, how does that impact all of these different markets, right? Workplace, healthcare, retail, higher ed. And so it was an interesting shift because, yeah, I started with BHDP then again, virtual. So the onboarding, the interview process, all that stuff was done virtually. Now, I think where I had a leg up was that I had, worked 25 years ago. I knew the underlying mission, a little bit of the culture. Of course, in 25 years, it shifted, right? You had different leadership, you had different people, they'd grown, different directions they wanted to go in. And it was a little bit different because I was working virtually in Indianapolis, where I was at the time, right? So I got hired. I was working there for 6 months virtually, and then the family and I moved down here to Cincinnati and was virtual for another 6 months while living in Cincinnati. And then, we gradually went back into the office. And it was an interesting time because you had both the shifting of where work was happening, but also in terms of leadership, right? There was a transition then for the culture, it's David trying to create the culture there, built on what had already been there, right? Trying to make it. But it was able to get kind of blown up because we were in a different place, right? Wow. We were post-pandemic, just as we were talking at the roundtable here.
So during the time when the pandemic was blowing up every firm, you guys were also going through an internal.
Absolutely.
Plus you had a real influx of new people as well. So what was that dynamic like? And what were the strains and stressors of, transition is tough anyway, but change. This much and this much of a sea change, what were you going through and how do you think you've come out better?
Sure. And, to be fair, we're still in that process. I mean, change, takes a long time. Even when people are willing to do it and are positioned to do it. When you get smacked with a pandemic, as you're trying to transition and change, it's that much harder, right? And so what we found is as the change was occurring, just like other firms with the pandemic, people were moving and shifting their priorities. They could change their lifestyles, be other places. And so, and then on top of that, right, perhaps you had some staff was letting go because retail wasn't happening, right? Or this wasn't. So as utilization rates were changing for our clients, our teams had to shift as well. Over the pandemic, we did a pretty good job of right-sizing the firm and the ship. But as we came out of the pandemic, you really had that growth, right? Companies would go, okay, we got to figure this out, right? We've got to
demand.
We might not add space, but we have to right-size our facilities, and so we brought on so many people. I think 60-some people. Most of those being the emerging professionals, right? So a lot of out of college or just a few years out of college, and so you had this mix of people that had a long-term cultural knowledge and in it, right? And versus this new group coming in had no idea, right? They had no idea the mission, the vision, cultural attributes. And so but you also had new leadership. So that was in churn too. So things were changing. And so it was like this perfect storm, I would say. Heck, we even brought on for the first time, but we had a talent development person came on board a year after I started. Just 6 months ago, I would say, we brought on a vice president of people, right? So we were doing all that without even a leader in terms of people. It was all trying to be done by, I think, David Johnson, the executive board and stuff. And it's just a lot happening, a lot of moving pieces in something that's so critical.
Right.
Again, I think like other companies, we saw productivity was working because we could work from home, we could work from anywhere. But you saw that lack of, I think, innovation. You saw that lack of coordination on the same page, everybody on the same page, right? And so as we came back to the office, that got better and better, but we're still figuring it out. Yeah. We have a policy that is everybody's in the office at least Tuesday through Thursday. Mondays and Fridays tend to be people who can stay at home, which, I think is great from a flexibility standpoint. I think where the struggle is work doesn't work that way. Life doesn't work that way, and for people that are more tenured, more senior, like myself, if I need to do something on a Wednesday, I'm going to stay home. I have that privilege of, right, I'll make that work, but I'll still work. I might come in another day. But I find that's much harder for your younger staff who don't have that privilege. They don't feel that empowered to do that, right, and able to do it. And so you see a lot of struggle, I think, there.
Now, with that transition, do you have like two cultures operating in the company, or how? And I know you've got new people in place, and a lot of companies are going through a lot of transition. I mean, when you look at the big quit, 50 million employees, 1/3 of the workplace.
Yeah.
So how are you redefining, because it's a different culture? So are you going through a process of who are we? What is our mission now in this new seminal moment that we're going through? I mean, you take clients through the process.
Right.
Are you guys taking yourselves through the process?
Right. So what I would say is I think a lot of those conversations and process for our company is happening at the leadership level.
Okay.
So what I think is the impact of that is the less tenured, less seniority, lower level employees aren't feeling it, aren't seeing it. But again, they don't have a background in it, so they don't know what they don't know, right? They don't know what's changing or not.
Right.
I think it's those of us in the middle that are feeling it.
Feeling
the strain and the stress, because we know what it was. We know where we want it to go. We can't force it to go there, right? And
it's the hero's journey, right?
As always.
Yeah, you took the blue pill, and now you got to fight the dragons and the villains and come out.
Is ignorance bliss? Maybe it is, you know. So
collectively is a different one. Well, you have been able to apply your unique mix in a Fifth Third Bank.
Yeah.
So was that the first major project you've been able to bring this kind of community lens, community approach in? What did that look like, and what did it yield?
Sure. So a lot of that was informed by my work with like neighborhoods, towns, cities, working with mayors, planning departments, on the urban community design side, right? And so as I came into professional practice again, it was like, how could I bring that knowledge and what I knew it could do, the power of that, into the corporate world? And so Fifth Third really was that first project that we started to look at in that lens, because they were so community oriented. They talked about community banking, right? They're down on Fountain Square with the heart of Cincinnati. They were the backdrop for that. So they didn't really have a choice. They had to walk that talk. So we were trying to help them not only bridge perhaps the external to the public realm, but also how do you make sure you're doing that on the inside, with your own people? And so that really helped drive some of those conversations. Valerie, I love, has such a depth of knowledge and understanding around urban planning and all those concepts, how they come together, so outside of architecture, but how that impacts it. And so she was a great and willing ally in driving that. And then you add Patrick Donnelly into the mix and Chris Collett, and like it was just this kind of power group that got it. And so they weren't afraid to go and do it, right? A lot of clients you have to, convince, right, and cajole and make it happen.
So help me understand the difference between what you did with kind of this community-based approach versus just the traditional stakeholder engagement. So what is the difference in the model?
Yeah, so at Fifth Third, a lot of it being that engagement of their own people, right? Really thinking through that empathy of, what's it like for your everyday employee? It's not just talking to leadership. It's throughout the firm, trying to make everybody's daily journey better. They were thinking about personas. Fifth Third does a great job of I help them with their voice of the customer, right? They understand what's the experience, what's the journey for a customer in one of our branch banks, right?
Okay, right.
Well, you could take that same thinking and apply it to the company of like, what's the journey for our people?
What did they learn?
They learned that our people need to come together.
Okay.
Right. They get to have spaces for that.
So that's kind of contrary to what a lot of people are saying, that we don't need to come together.
Right.
We just come together when I feel like I need to. So what what did they see and learn that said they need to come together?
Right. And so we, not only them, I saw this in another project that we have, a pharmaceutical project, right? And what they found is this sense of like, yeah, we all went off on our own during the COVID. We had Microsoft Teams or whatever, and that allowed us to be productive.
Okay.
Right. It was like this digital bandage we could put over the wound of the pandemic. But what they found is we were missing innovation. Our culture took a nosedive.
Wow.
You know, it was hard for people to continue connecting in those relationships. And so I love Valerie and Patrick really came up with this, you know, the on-site is the new off-site, right? So where companies used to send their people off for retreats and to come together and brainstorm and innovate, they created places in Fifth Third Bank for that to happen on-site.
Wow.
You know, as opposed to going out, whereas no, when people are going to come into the office, they're going to come together. Let's make it a place for them to do that, that enables them to connect both at personal level as well as a work level.
So I've seen leadership say we need to come together.
Yeah.
I've seen leadership talk about culture and innovation and coordination. How did it translate into the people feeling that same thing? Because that's where I've seen the gap.
Yes.
Leaders get it. The business needs it.
Right.
People say, that's your issue. It's not my issue. So how did that translate into people willingly coming back together?
Yeah. And, you know, really, it's setting aside the ego of design, right? Design can only go so far.
Right.
You know, we could design the most beautiful place in the world, but if it is not, the people processes aren't there, right? The thinking through it, the transparency, the trust, forget it. It's not going to work at all. So I think Fifth Third took great pains to work through that with their people, right? Trying to talk about why you need to come in. Here's what it is. And so when those spaces were brought online, those new spaces, as people came in, it was like, oh, wow, I'm going to come work here because I feel supported, right? I will have the technology. I will have the space. I'll have people policy that's helping me
Things
to get
that
the job
they can't
done.
do at home.
Exactly. The resources. Right. Valerie talks about it as palpable joy. You know, it's one of those metrics that we're going after. We've started again. Valerie's been great because as a client, we've been co-creating theory and principles and ways of doing things with her. One of those that started out was KXIs. So key experience indicators versus key performance indicators.
I love it.
Right?
Yeah.
And so we have these business, KPIs, right? Are we hitting these or not? But
those are lagging indicators,
right? We have leading and lagging.
So you have leading
so
with
KXIs. We start to think about, well, what's the experience of doing that? What's the return on the investment from a people side?
Wow.
What's their experience like? So we've been working through that. It's even moving forward with one of our government agencies because they've come down, right? You've seen the general surgeon say, hey, loneliness is an epidemic to itself.
Right.
The government has actually come out, OMB, and said, look, all agencies must have a way to measure their organizational health. Right? And so that organizational health isn't about how many widgets you sold, right? Those kind of KPIs. It's about, do people trust each other, right? Are we retaining people and why, right? Like it's those things of thinking through what's that actual experience, which I think has become that silver lining of the pandemic, right? Is it made us adjust our thinking or refocus? Because as Mike Cable said many times, like we for so long have thought about the square feet as designers. We haven't thought about whose feet are in that square.
I love it.
Right? And so it's the shift from KPI to really KXI.
So to wrap this up, I want you to look out to 2025. You know, we're 6 months into what we're all saying is the new rhythm, normalization of life and work, but there's a lot of ripple effect, things under the surface of the water.
Yeah.
What do you think is going to happen to the workplace? Or if you were going to say, this is what I hope happens, what do you think is going to go on for the next 18 months?
I think it's that transition in trust, intentionality we just talked about, right? We have to get away from these broad like policies, we talked about, right, equality versus equity, consistency. Like, we can't just say everyone has to do this, right? There has to take into account the flexibility of people's lives, their work schedules, and how we do that. The trick will be is, how does design play a part in that, right? And so design can't do it alone. The big one we like to think about is that space, tech, and people, those three elements together, right? Because IT isn't going to solve it on their own. HR isn't going to solve it on their own, and real estate isn't. But if we enable and empower those three groups to come together and think beyond their, hey, how many computers do we have? How much square footage do we have? Do I have policies? To, how do we make the best work experience for our people? If we can get them to that kind of thinking, I think we can really move it forward.
Well, Justin, thank you so much for taking the time and sharing. It's a unique mix. I wish you the best going through all the transition. I mean, it's a healthy culture. It's got longevity behind it. So you'll be different as an organization. I'm convinced you'll be better. And thank you for coming on to the Resilience Lab.
Thanks for having me.
You bet.